X-Men Days of Future Past is finally out, and I feel like in order to review this movie I should probably explain my relationship with the X-Men movie franchise. Now, the X-Men were characters that I grew up loving. You know, I read the comic books and watched the 90s cartoon, and I will have been about maybe 10 or 11 when the first X-Men movie came out, which I absolutely loved. I remember renting it from Blockbuster, went to the cinema to see X2, and have enjoyed the franchise since then, but it is a very inconsistent franchise. While the first two X-Men films were great, the third one, The Last Stand, which Brett Ratner directed, while I don't think it's as bad as people say that it is, you know, people absolutely maul that movie, I don't think it's that bad, but it's definitely a giant misstep for a franchise and made some mistakes. And then you had X-Men Origins Wolverine, which was the worst of the series so far, but it started to redeem itself with X-Men First Class and to a lesser extent the Wolverine. Both of those movies I've reviewed in the past on my channel if you want to see my thoughts on those. So I guess I had sort of moderated expectations going into this one. It's written by Simon Kinberg, among other writers, but he's like the main writer. He wrote X3. So that might have been cause for concern, but it's also the return of Bryan Singer, who directed the first two X-Men movies, as well as the original cast, who we haven't really seen since X-Men The Last Stand, and the First Class cast, like James McAvoy as Charles Xavier and Michael Fassbender as Magneto, Jennifer Lawrence, you know, those guys are back as well. So I thought, if anything, this sounds like an interesting premise to bring all these sort of existing franchise figures back together for one movie. So I went in with moderate expectations, and, you know, right out the bat, I will say that I actually really enjoyed this movie. I thought it was really good. I was hoping that it would try to do something a little bit different with the franchise, and it did. Basically, the plot, and I won't go into sort of specifics because I won't want to spoil it for anyone, but the plot revolves around the X-Men in the future, played by the original cast members like you have Hugh Jackman, Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, Shawn Ashmore, Ellen Page. They're all in the future, which is like a desolate wasteland, being hunted by robots or sentinels, which specifically target mutants. Now, they've been programmed by a scientist called Bolivar Trask, played by Peter Dinklage. And as I say, they kill mutants, so the sort of future is very Terminator-esque, James Cameron-style dystopian future with, you know, lots of violence and wars going on and battles and stuff. So we start there, and basically what the X-Men decide to do is send Wolverine's consciousness back in time to his younger body in 1973 in order to stop an event which will in turn sort of lead to that dystopian future, to try and sort of alter the past. That's probably as far as I can go into the plot without sort of spoiling specifics. And it is something actually that I think you don't need to have seen all the other X-Men movies in order to get a lot out of this. There is quite a bit of exposition here and there. Quite a lot is explained by the characters, but it never feels too sort of convoluted. It always remains sort of light and breezy and entertaining, and I think so long as, you know, you keep your wits about you and concentrate, if you haven't seen the other movies, you will still probably enjoy this and understand enough to, you know, enjoy it as a film in its own right. So that's the basic plot. Now, going in, I was a little bit worried that, knowing that they'd altered the comic book storyline, it used to be Kitty Pryde who went back in time, but now it's Wolverine. I didn't want this to become the Wolverine show, which, you know, tends to happen with X-Men movies, other than First Class. While I love Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, you know, give somebody else the limelight. I have to say that they don't do that. Basically, Wolverine is one cog in this giant machine of the movie. He is basically a plot device and serves only to connect the two sort of timelines in the film. So I like the fact that they didn't sort of make it Wolverine's movie. I think the movie really belongs to James McAvoy as Charles Xavier, because back in 1973 it picks up where sort of, I think they said it was 10 years after the events of First Class, where he's basically doing his Christian Bale Batman thing of moping around in his mansion in his pyjamas. He can now walk, which they explain. and basically feels sorry for himself. And meanwhile, Magneto's gone off to do his sort of big bad Magneto thing of trying to sort of help mutants and punish humans at the same time. So those guys aren't really speaking. Wolverine has to bring them together in order to help him stop the event which will lead to the really crappy future that's coming for them. James McAvoy is an actor who I always thought, and still think really, is overrated. People talk about how great he is. I don't really think that about him, but he is really good in this as Charles Xavier. I thought he brings enough sort of emotion to the role and layers it enough to make it interesting. I always found him in First Class. I didn't feel like he quite fit with the character, but it definitely feels like he's grown into it in this movie. So I like James McAvoy. I like Michael Fassbender as Magneto. Michael Fassbender is one of those actors who not only is he actually a terrific actor, but he has great presence as well, and I think he's perfect for the role of young Magneto. Hugh Jackman, as always, is brilliant as Logan or Wolverine. He owns that role now, and to be honest, I would much rather they kill off Logan than ever recast him in this incarnation of X-Men. I think if you ever reboot the franchise completely, then fair enough, recast the character. But I think in this sort of series, this franchise, it's Hugh Jackman. You can't sort of change that. So those guys are all really good. Jennifer Lawrence's Mystique plays a much bigger role in this one, and it's actually good to see a female character have a sort of larger role in this movie. Having said that though, there aren't many other female mutants that are really given much to do. I mean, Ellen Page as Kitty Pryde. Kitty Pryde, being one of my favourite X-Men characters in the comics, is given really nothing to do other than send Wolverine's consciousness back in time. So the only time you ever see her, she's like basically doing that, just kneeling behind him sort of thing and not doing anything. And you also have Blink, who's one of the mutants in the future who can teleport. Her powers are really visually very interesting, but again, she's not given an awful lot to do. You don't really get to know the character at all. So those are some minor gripes. A lot of the characters are underdeveloped and underexplored, but that's because the movie is so chock full of characters that they couldn't possibly explore everyone. They just wouldn't have time. That being said, what I'll do, I'll discuss basically what I liked first of all. So I like the performances by and large. I like the fact that the script, while it does succeed in sort of explaining and tying up a lot of loose ends in the other X-Men movies, it doesn't completely, but it manages to do enough in that regard to, I think, satisfy the fans. And it never buckles under its own weight. It never allows the fact that it's trying to tie everything together to bog it down. It remains a light, entertaining, breezy blockbuster. It's very pacey. It never drags. It's actually a testament to the screenwriters, Simon Kinberg, and I believe Matthew Vaughn and Jane Goldman had a pass at the script or wrote the story and were involved in some respect. It's succeeded in that regard, that it manages to be entertaining but also do all this sort of heavy lifting for the franchise. So the script I actually like. Having said that though, minor sidebar, is that there's a lot that they don't explain. They don't explain how Xavier has his body back after the events of X-Men The Last Stand, which, if you've listened to the DVD commentary for that movie, you will have been given an explanation, but it's not one that's really ever explained in the movies. It doesn't explain how Kitty Pryde can now send people back in time. Are we to assume this is a secondary mutation? Because they've said in the other movies that, you can have a secondary mutation and give you a different power, but it's never explained. There's just plot holes that you could drive a truck through. But again, they only had so much time for this movie, and they could have probably done a 3.5 hour epic, because this is about 2 hours 10 minutes, but they could have done that and explained everything. But they sort of say to you, buckle up and don't pay too much attention to those plot holes, just have a good time, which is what the movie does. So those minor gripes aside, I like the script. The action's really well directed. I always think that Bryan Singer has quite a good eye for action, and this movie seems to have woken him up out of a slump, because after the first two X-Men movies, what has he done? Superman Returns, Valkyrie, Jack the Giant Slayer or whatever. none of them have been really any good. I mean, I like Superman Returns to a certain extent, but he's not really done much. But he comes to this film almost like a fresh pair of eyes. You know, the action's really creative. The movie opens with a big fight between several mutants in the future and some sentinels that are trying to kill them. And it basically shows for the first time on screen the real teamwork between the X-Men and how their powers complement each other. And he manages to do that without verbally explaining what their powers are or what they're doing. He just shows you, and you can sort of piece it together, and that was really good and really creative, and that applies to a lot of the action set pieces. The standout set piece, as you probably already heard, is a scene with Quicksilver. Now, he's played by Evan Peters from American Horror Story, an actor I've always really liked. People were worried about Quicksilver going into this movie because of the Empire cover that he appeared on, where he basically looked like a douche. He just looked stupid. He's a standout in this. A lot of people will leave this movie saying Quicksilver's my favourite mutant, he's my favourite X-Man. Basically, the thing with Quicksilver is he's Magneto's son in the comics. He's also going to appear in Avengers Age of Ultron, played by a different actor, and that'll be a different incarnation of the character, so it'll be interesting to see how they deal with the character. But Quicksilver in this is sort of a young mutant who just loves having his power. He basically has the powers of the Flash, who can run faster than a speeding bullet and all that. The set piece in question is basically him breaking somebody out of a prison and having a good time while doing it. That was definitely the standout sequence, and again, it feels like the first time in this franchise showing a mutant actually having fun with the powers, because I think this franchise can sometimes feel a bit dour, a bit too serious, and this is a lot more colourful and a lot more fun. My only gripe with that is Quicksilver's in a couple of scenes, he steals them, he steals the movie, but then he disappears, and you see him like again right at the end, but that's it. Give us more Quicksilver, but, you know, again, he's not one of the main characters, so I can understand why they sort of had him for that sequence and then put him to one side, because he will probably be back for the sequel. What's that going to be called? Age of Apocalypse, or just X-Men Apocalypse, something like that. No doubt we'll bring him back, and I hope Evan Peters comes back, because he was a standout in this. The way the film is shot as well, it's I saw it in 3D, and apart from that Quicksilver sequence, really there's nothing here to warrant the 3D. I would recommend seeing it in 2D. The Quicksilver sequence, because of the way it's shot's really impressive in 3D, but other than that, the rest of the film's fairly flat. It is very well shot though, the action's very well shot. The camera keeps its distance and remains steady. You can see what's going on and where people are in relation to each other, so all that was great. The only thing is, with it being shot in 3D, or maybe it was post-converted, I'm not sure, it's shot on digital, and sometimes some of the shots can look a bit cheap in the darker scenes and stuff, but that's a minor gripe. Again, another standout performance is Peter Dinklage's Bolivar Trask. He was great. He is another actor who has a great presence and has a very sort of commanding voice and stuff. The only problem with his character is you don't really get to know the character. I would have liked to have spent a little more time getting to know Trask and why he's doing what he's doing. His motivations are a little bit murky and a little bit shallow. You know, I think if they could have devoted another few scenes to him and getting to know him a little bit, that would have made that element of the film a bit more interesting. But by and large, the film succeeds a lot more than it fails. It's not a perfect film by any stretch of the imagination. I have to say, though, the score was great as well, and to be honest, the beginning sort of mini title sequence right at the beginning of the movie, it made me feel like I was sat in the cinema 10 years ago watching X2 with a bunch of friends after school, and it just took me back to that place, and it was fun to be back with these characters. With, you know, the original sort of crew as well. It was just a nostalgic feeling, so I think existing fans of a franchise will dig this, but it doesn't alienate new viewers. I think that probably you should watch First Class before going into this, but I do think you'd be able to see this without seeing any of the others and get something out of it. So it is a very entertaining movie. It does succeed mostly in tying the two timelines together, the original cast and the First Class cast. It does leave a lot unanswered, but bearing in mind that there's another Wolverine movie coming out, there's another X-Men movie, there's a Gambit movie, an X-Force movie, and they've also said that they might branch out into television as well. So those plot holes could potentially be resolved and tied up in the other movies. And while that's a bit of a get out, you know, really you should try and do that in this film and make it sort of as self-contained as possible. You know, at least we know that they have options there. So basically my final thoughts on this movie would be that it's definitely a return to form for the franchise. I definitely felt like First Class was a return to form, and then the Wolverine, loved the first two-thirds, last third of that movie, the last act was terrible. This movie though is a lot more consistent and concise. The performances are great, the direction's great. It does stumble over its own sort of plot threads now and again, but other than that, it's a very entertaining film. It's miles better than The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Is it as good as anything Marvel's done? For example, Captain America: The Winter Soldier? Not that good, but it's still very enjoyable, and I'm very excited to see where the franchise can go from here. So those are my thoughts on X-Men Days of Future Past. Please tell me yours, I'm very interested to hear. I do read every comment that you guys post, but please keep it spoiler-free down there. And I hope you enjoy the movie. If you do go and see it, I do recommend it. If you're not a fan of X-Men, give it a go anyway. It's a good sort of Friday night blockbuster. It's very entertaining. So X-Men Days of Future Past, I do heartily recommend.